Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to this week, okay? We've got three lessons this week. One that we're going to do today on westward expansion, the other on some compromises that are going on in the 1820s and 1850s, and then another that's going to look at the differences between the northern and southern economies and how that is going to contribute to the division of the country. Now, where we left off last week, the last lesson last week dealt with Texas and California and our conflict with Mexico and how we're going to get Texas and California from Mexico. That lesson leads us to this lesson because there's been a desire to move out west since the country began. I mean, when you think about it, when you go back and you remember the French and Indian War, and after the French and Indian War, the proclamation of 1763, which said that we could not cross the Appalachian Mountains, okay, that we could not, move west, and how much that bothered us. We have been a nation that has continually wanted to move west. And California and Texas are going to allow us to do that. So this lesson today is going to look at all kinds of issues tied to this westward expansion. It's going to build on where we left off last week, okay? And we're going to talk about things like this guy right here, famous inventor Eli Whitney and his key invention. We've got railroads. We're going to mention railroads and canals. All right. Notice, hey, there's Santa Claus with the reindeer because Santa Claus wants to go out west too. Very appropriate this week as we get closer and closer to Christmas. We're going to talk about issues with Native Americans, especially issues with Native Americans and this gentleman right here, Andrew Jackson. And then this guy right here is President Polk. And President Polk is going to coin a term, manifest destiny. And we're going to define what manifest destiny is in this lesson today. All right. So all kinds of things that we're going to be talking about as we move west as a country. All right. So on your worksheet, Americans begin to move to the Midwest, the Southwest, and Texas in search of new land to farm. Okay, that's going to be one of the primary motivators to get us to move west is land. And that's, to be honest with you, the government is going to take a role in giving us land. There are going to be big land auctions and land sales, and there are going to be rules put in place. Once we get enough people out there, we can carve up that land and it can become states. The government is going to encourage us moving west so that we can grow the country. Now, movement west would not have been possible without two key inventions. One is the growth of railroads, and the other are canals. Now, canals are going to be kind of a bigger deal in the South, okay, because the South is going to be dependent on rivers. We're going to talk about that later this week with the differences in the economy. But the growth of railroads and the growth of canals are going to help the growth of an industrial economy, and it's going to help people move west. All right. Railroads, especially, you're going to find those in the north because that's where the industrial economy is. And when you think about it, what does it take to make a railroad? You're going to have iron machines, you're going to have iron railroad tracks, iron locomotives and things. That sort of stuff is found in the north more so than the south. Now, one of the big canals and one of the big building projects that occurs is the Erie Canal, which is going to connect the Hudson River in New York with Lake Erie. Now, Lake Erie is part of the Great Lakes system, and Lake Erie connects to the other Great Lakes. So this Erie Canal is going to open up a bunch of trading possibilities around the Great Lakes region. All right, so it's a big deal that we get that constructed. So railroads and canals are going to make it possible for us to move west. Now, speaking of key inventions besides railroads and canals, another key invention during this time is going to be invented by this guy right here. This is Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney's key invention is the cotton gin. Now, Eli Whitney intended the cotton gin to help end slavery. He thought, and it makes sense, if you replace the work that a slave would do with a machine, then you're not going to need as many slaves, all right? Because what you could do is you take the cotton plant, the white fiber, all right, you put it in here or on this side. You can actually put it on both sides. And you turn this crank, and that crank is going to turn a series of combs, And the combs are going to go through that white fiber, and you can see they're going to push out all the impurities, all the seeds and the pieces of the plant, the leaves and stuff like that. It's going to push all that out. So all that you're left with in the machine itself is the white, fluffy, what we know as the cotton part. Okay. And like I said, Eli Whitney said, if I'm using machine, because normally you would have a bunch of slaves do that, if I replace all that with a machine, then that will decrease slavery. Unfortunately, that is not what happens. Instead of decreasing slavery, it is actually going to increase slavery, and it is going to spread throughout the South, okay, and even into the West. Because what ends up happening is, because you can process the cotton plant quicker, then plantation owners begin to plant more cotton, which means you're going to need more slaves. So instead of actually decreasing slavery, which is what Eli Whitney's intent was, it increases slavery. Slavery spreads into the West, and that's what our next lesson is going to be. And we get a new cash crop, king cotton. Cotton becomes the main crop of the South. It begins to replace those other cash crops that we talked about: tobacco, rice, indigo. They're still going to be important, but cotton is going to be the new big one that takes its place. So that's Eli Whitney and his cotton gin. Now, this desire to move west is best summarized in the term manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that the U.S. should spread from coast to coast, that we should stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it provided political support for territorial expansion. To be honest with you, this is why we get involved in places like Texas and California, because we want to fulfill this idea of manifest destiny, spreading from coast to coast. Some people attach a religious connotation with it, okay? Many believe it is God's will that we expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And we are willing to do anything to get all the land between those two boundaries, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. We are willing to go to war, which is what we did with Mexico. It's what Texas was willing to do to gain its independence. Okay, we are willing to go to war to get it, and we are willing to buy it if need be. And we're going to look at a map here in just a second that shows all the different progress that we make moving from coast to coast. Now, I want you to pay attention to this picture right here, okay? Because if we were in class, we would talk about it a little bit more in detail. There is a question on the quiz dealing with this picture. This is a graphic representation of manifest destiny. You have here this female figure in the center, and she is supposed to represent another important female figure, Lady Liberty. Okay, so she represents liberty. Notice she is headed out west. And look what is coming with her. You've got railroads here in the background and the foreground. You've got canals and boats way back here. You've got settlers, okay, there and back here. And look what she's doing. She's bringing all this civilization, all this progress to the dark west. Notice it's kind of stormy over here. You've got all these buffalo, and you've got Native Americans as well, these fierce animals. There's, I think, a wolf down here. So the idea of this picture, this is manifest destiny. Why do we want to go out west? Because it is God's will. Why would God want us to do this? Because we are bringing salvation. We are bringing civilization to the unsettled West. Okay? That's why we need to do that. And this is why people are going to be willing to fight for that territory and buy that territory if it helps us achieve this goal of bringing civilization out west. That's manifest destiny. And like I said, President Polk is the president that's going to coin that term. He's the one that's really going to push us to go to war with Mexico because he wants to see this dream fulfilled, this dream realized. Now, who's out west? I mean, you can see from this picture, all right, once again, as we move further and further west, we're going to come into contact with Native Americans. In fact, a lot of the Native Americans we come into contact with are out west because that's where we have pushed them since the beginning. Okay. And we mentioned in our last unit last week, on our lessons last week, we talked about Andrew Jackson and Andrew Jackson's treatment of the Indians. All right. Well, the idea of manifest destiny becomes a new political policy and settlement of new territories begins. Land is given away in Oklahoma and the Midwestern territories, and the people that move out there are called Sooners because we want them out west sooner rather than later. Now, as I've been talking about, who's already out there? Well, Native Americans. And as these Sooners, as these settlers push west, they're going to come into conflict with Native Americans once again. Okay. We're going to see a series of very violent, very bloody conflicts between between settlers from the east and Native Americans. And once again, the Native Americans are going to be forcefully removed from their ancestral homelands. They've already been forced out there by previous pieces of legislation, but now they're going to be pushed even further west. And eventually what's going to happen is we're going to see the creation of reservations, and this is where you're going to go. All right. And we promise we're not going to mess with this territory anymore. The guy that is most often associated with this is Andrew Jackson. And we talked with the lesson last week, the famous episode in Jackson's presidency, the Indian Removal Act. In the famous episode with the Indian Removal Act is the Trail of Tears during Jackson's presidency. And I mentioned a little bit last week, the Trail of Tears forced Cherokee Indians, about 15,000 Cherokee Indians, to move from the Georgia, Florida area. There were also some of the Carolinas around the Great Smoky Mountains. So they're moving from the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida out to the Oklahoma territory. The land in Georgia was needed for cotton. That's how we justify pushing them off. Okay. And of course, they're moving from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, which typically have a very mild to warm climate, out to Oklahoma, which has a very, very cold climate. So between those that are going to die on the journey and those, once they get out to Oklahoma, that are unable to survive because it is so cold out there, the Trail of Tears is going to get that name because 1 out of every 4 Cherokee die along the way. 25% of the Cherokee that start out on this journey are going to die. Okay, so 25% of the 15,000 are going to die. That's why we call it the Trail of Tears. And once again, it shows the horrendous treatment that Native Americans often face with our desire to move west. And we've seen that since the beginning of the class, okay, with Europeans coming over and pushing them off their land as well. Now, the last thing I want to show you is this map of westward expansion, okay? And I believe there's a map on your worksheet. If you don't want to fill it in, I totally understand that, but be sure you pay attention because this map is going to show up on the quiz. Okay, so here's the United States, the continental United States. Alaska and Hawaii are not there. We're going to start over here with this group right here. Now, what were these? You're right, 13 colonies. And we start in 1607. Why do we start in 1607? Because of Jamestown, okay? The first permanent English settlement in the New World, Jamestown, 1607. And remember, here's this proclamation line of 1763 through the Appalachian Mountains, okay? Because on the other side, all right, this yellow area here, that is what Britain wins from the French and Indian War, okay? It's gained by the British in 1763 from the French and Indian War. Now notice, now we've expanded all the way this blue line, and I know that came up just a second ago. Here's the Mississippi River. So we moved from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. Now, we will get control of this territory, and by that I mean the United States will get control of this territory in 1781 once we've won the American Revolution. Okay, 1781, 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. This is what's going to get us that land. We've got to win our freedom during the American Revolution. Okay. Then we're going to cross the Mississippi to this territory right here. What is that? Louisiana Purchase Territory, 1803. President Jefferson. Jefferson is in charge. Remember, he buys that from Napoleon of France. Napoleon needs it, needs the money to fight his wars against Britain. We want to expand. Jefferson is not sure he's got the constitutional power to do so, but he does it anyway. And we get all this territory, which is going to take us out to the Rocky Mountains. Okay? And we sent Lewis and Clark out to explore that. And Jefferson told Lewis and Clark, don't feel that you need to stop at the Rockies. Let's see how far we can actually go before we hit the coast. Okay, so they're going to come out here to this territory right here and then circle back to the East Coast on their core of discovery. Okay, so there's Louisiana Purchase, 1803. Then we get the War of 1812. We're going after Britain again. We're going to win that war. And as part of that war, we're going to get this piece of land up here. This is the Northwest Territory. Okay, now we win it because we win the War of 1812, but we're not going to really settle it. We're not really going to get out there until the 1840s. Okay, so we're going to get that 1812. Okay, now there's another little piece over here, and this is not on the presentation, but it is on your quiz, so I want you to pay attention to it, and that's Spanish Florida. We will cede or buy Florida from Spain in 1819, okay? So we're going to fill this in 1819, all right? All right, so we'll get Florida 1819. We buy it from Spain. Now, we've just got to fill in this part right here, all right? Our next big acquisition is going to be this blue area right here. And of course, that covers Texas. All right. 1835, we get the War for Texas Independence. And remember, we talked about this last week. You had Americans living in Texas, but they saw themselves as Texans. They did not want to be controlled by Mexico. Mexico had the land, so they revolt. You had the massacre at the Alamo, where all the soldiers at the Alamo are killed. Okay. And eventually Texas is going to win its independence. It will be its own nation for a while. It's the Lone Star Republic. That's why it's got one star on its flag. But then it will eventually get absorbed by the United States. And of course, Texas is going to come in as a slave state, which is going to cause some problems down the road. And we'll talk about that in our next lesson. Okay. But we get Texas from the War for Texas Independence, 1839. Once we're out there fighting for Texas, okay, we decide, hey, we would really like this last part here to complete the puzzle. So we keep battling Mexico over California. And it is going to be the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that is going to secure us California. And between the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and then the Gadsden Purchase, which is going to fill in that last little bottom part of Arizona and New Mexico, between those two things, we have now filled in the lower 48 states, the continental United States. And this idea of manifest destiny from stretching from coast to coast becomes a realization. Now, the only two pieces of territory that we need that will become states are Alaska and Hawaii, and that's not going to happen until the 20th century. Okay, so we have filled in the map from coast to coast. Okay, sorry about that. We filled in the map from coast to coast. Manifest destiny has been realized. Don't forget, Florida down here is purchased from Spain in 1819. Okay, we buy that from Spain in 1819. And now we are in control of all this land. Now, one of the issues that comes up, and we didn't touch on it in this lesson, but it's going to be a big one in the next one, is slavery. As people are moving out west, especially people from the southern states here, they want to bring slavery with them. And there becomes a big debate on whether or not slavery is going to be allowed in this new territory over here. Okay, and how are we going to prevent that? What are we going to do to maintain balance? Things like that. That's what we're going to cover in our second lesson through a series of compromises in 1820 and the 1850s.